Hey guys, MOTTOsound here from Life with a Sixth Sense. Here we talk about things to make life seem just a little simpler. Enjoy today's podcast. Hey guys, MOTTOsound here from Life with a Sixth Sense. Today I'm joined with Jay Hodgson, who's on faculty at the Western University, where he teaches courses primarily in songwriting, in project paradigm, and record production. He's also one of two mastering engineers at MOTTOsound Studios in England, whose credits include tracks from records by the likes of Rush, 3 Days Grace, Billy Ray Cyrus, and even Glen Campbell. I'm a huge fan of all these artists, so this is amazing.
Cool.
He's been nominated for 2 Junos, and he's contributed to music to films recognized by the likes of Rolling Stones magazine, and he also has a second book out called Understanding Records. All right. Hey, man, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool. So how long have you been in the studio engineering business?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose I've been in and out of studios for decades.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, my first major experience in a studio, I was invited along in, this has got to be 1993, maybe 94. I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And I was playing sporadically with a guy named John McDermott.
Okay.
And he had a number one record in Australia, and they were recording his follow-up. And so I got to participate in sessions for that, and just sort of hang around. And that wound up going platinum.
Wow.
And getting a Juno nomination. That was Love is a Voyage.
Okay, yeah.
And I remember being Kevin Doyle engineered that, and that was sort of my first experience in a studio. That was McClear Pathé, and I remember walking in, and they were like, platinum Rush albums on the wall and stuff. And I didn't really know much about the studio at that point.
Right.
And they were very nice to me. They let me sort of just wander around. Okay. I remember going home with 2 guitars. Like, music was pretty lucrative back then.
Yeah. I bet.
I got a 12-string.
Damn.
and a Telly, I think.
Wow.
It was really, and I wasn't even like a Focus or anything. I was just sort of a kid that was playing with them, and it was used to be like a mentorship situation back then more than anything. So, that you would just come along, and then every so often they throw you in on a mic situation, but they would, that was more to humiliate you than
basically
anything else.
Yeah. That's sweet. So you didn't have like a little home studio growing up. You just went straight into the business.
What would a home studio comprise back then? Maybe like a Tascam 4-track.
Right. Yeah.
Or 8-track on little audio cassettes. Like an SM57 or something like that.
Yeah.
Don't forget, you had digital. This is one of the things that I'm like the annoying guy who corrects grammar online, because whenever people talk about, the move to digital, I always say, well, no, we had digital. We had ADAT and DAT back then.
Yeah.
But we weren't really running computers. And I remember and then I went down to Boston, of course, and did a lot of studio work then. But by 98, 99, a lot of studios had a computer, but often you would go to tape instead.
Yeah.
And I remember one studio I was at had a computer, and they had Cubase, and the thing crashed. It cost me like a couple $100 in time and rent to get it back up and running. And I didn't see what it contributed at that point. It didn't contribute very much for me, for my purposes, but I didn't, like, recalls didn't matter so much back then for me,
Mm-hmm, for sure.
You recorded very differently. You recorded, you committed to tape, and I remember I have an Allen and Heath board from like 86 kicking around somewhere. It's like a big giant 24 track console.
I'm familiar with them.
Yeah. And this is the one that had automation, and it was designed to hook in with a Commodore 64.
Okay.
And it could automate mutes. It's so funny what you don't even think about now with computers, but back in the day, if you had a lot of extraneous studio noise, sometimes part of the mixing process when you were, rendering down to DAT or whatever you were rendering down to, the little, stereo track that was going to be the mix, you'd have to mute tracks and stuff,
Yeah. Okay.
Anyways.
So, but also as far as the way things worked in the past compared to now, do you think that it's better the way it is now, or how do you think the evolution of studio engineering and mixing has come to be now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say it was a totally different thing in my opinion.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
It's almost like comparing theater to film work, in the sense that when you mixed, you had often 3 or 4 people at the mix board, moving faders, tweaking things here and there, and doing stuff like that, while you were rendering down, because people forget the mix was a performance,
Yeah.
And then
well, in the past, it was a live performance, and then I didn't know that,
because you had to render, right? Like you had to, you had your, let's say you had even something basic like a 16 or 24 track tape recording, right? In order to create a mix, you had to record onto another medium, a 2-channel, digital
stereo,
audio tape or something like that.
Yeah.
So anything that needed to happen, mutes, fades, panning, if you were going to do delays on something, often you'd print it, but all, sometimes you would send to a particular device. All those things had to happen somewhere between 0.0 and whatever the end of the track was. And often you'd take multiple passes at a mix, right?
Right.
Whereas now, a lot of that's gone. So, I often work with latch automation,
okay,
where you are sort of you're printing your mix moves in real time as they happen. I find that that all the mix moves tend to be a bit more believable, but at the same time, it's much more time consuming.
Yeah, I bet, for the artist and for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's in terms of the profession, as opposed to like the artistry and craft, it's way better now. All of these tools make your life a lot easier and better when you're working. Like, up until 4 years ago, I was still primarily analog when I mastered.
Right.
And so, if you were mastering, I did a lot of work in techno and EDM when that big wave was happening. I cleared like 1,000 tracks,
Oh my
God. And so if it was like an 8 or 10 minute track, you had to print the 8 or 10 minute track. And like a nightmare scenario was when, you'd get a click or a pop from a dirty line or somewhere in the line. Yeah. And you couldn't just go back and sort of overdub, because you get little phasing issues. This is a master, right?
Right.
So you'd pretty much have to render again. So you could spend 8 to 10 hours clearing, a 30-minute EP, just with all the recalls and everything involved in the analog format. And then actually, so I'll tell you a little story if you're interested.
Yeah, I'm interested.
Yeah, sure. So I was primarily analog. And then I had a client, and I'm not going to say names.
Of course not, yeah.
Who was really just annoying me. So I thought I would try to get fired.
Oh my God.
Wouldn't go away. And I thought I would just produce those. And I don't know, it was a really bad day. It had been years of working with this person. I felt that they didn't appreciate my work really. And so anyway, I flew it all into my workstation. I did my due diligence. I set up like a basic mastering line, but rendered really fast and loose digitally, and just completely in the box, and sent it back.
Yeah.
And they went from just being unbelievably critical to just raving about the masters. And so I was like, wow, I don't know what happened there. I thought they were messing with me at first, but no. And I listened, and I was like, that sounds good. So I did it. I worked similarly, when they would send me stuff. We worked pretty regularly. I'd clear a few things a week sometimes for this person. And I kept getting the same response. And so I took, I suppose, I guess it would be like a Zen approach. I just like, we're not knowing. So I was like, well, I'm doing something here, and I don't know consciously what it is, but it's working. So I would do 2 masters for every project for about 6 months. So I wouldn't say which was which, and I would just say one is analog, one's digital. Let me know your preference. And it was really fascinating. It was like 4 or 5 years ago where where that distinction mattered for some reason to people.
Right.
And they would always inevitably choose the digital master, the one done completely in the box. And then they'd be like, that's the analog one, isn't it? And so it was fascinating. And so I slowly moved over to almost completely in the box, unless I felt that or almost completely digital, if people don't know, unless I felt that aesthetically something about the analog render was going to bring something out in the track, in the mix of the master.
Yeah.
And so it was really fascinating for me, and 100%, and we're talking like about, 50, 60 projects, 100% of them went for the in the box master. And it just occurred to me that 2 generations have passed since we've become since consumers decided they're not going to care about quote unquote sound quality, and instead more interested in availability. And so what's happened is you've had these generations conditioned on, very digital sound aesthetics, which if I were to define that, I would say like clarity, transient detail, all the sort of typical things that you would get, like not much of a noise floor, dynamic range is less. And I've sort of come around to it myself, and very rarely do I render out of the box now. And that's usually an artistic decision for me. But I learned that accidentally. And all of my colleagues and all the people that I've interviewed, I have a book coming out called Audio Mastering the Artists. Okay. And that's with my partner at MOTTOsound, Russ Hepworth Sawyer. He's over in England. And we've interviewed people at most of the major mastering houses that are still surviving, and most of the major mastering engineers, and 90% of them are in the box now. And again, it's like, it's a labor thing more than anything else. It's like everyone prefers this sound. Our clients prefer the masters we render this way. And then once we have our line, we listen during render, but we can range around the track, and, you can listen to, what we call the fat parts of the waveform, which are the loudest parts, and set your initial line and go back and forth. Things you just couldn't do before, know?
Yeah. And the thing is, like, I'm finding the more that, because, I'm actually just starting. Like, I'm 20 years old, and I started studio stuff when I was 17, so very, very new. Right, yeah. And so, like, when I started, I was like, oh, you have to have a mixing board because, like, it looks cooler and all that stuff. And then now I'm just like, whoa, the box has so many things to offer, and it actually sounds better because of the noise floor and stuff.
I will say, from an engineering perspective, nothing beats an analog strip.
I was about to ask that next, actually. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, from it, so I teach as well, right? And I like to use the gear I teach on, because I don't teach to an installed site. I teach to what I call the project paradigm, which is pretty much how people work now. And I have a little 8-channel Toft ATB that's there for the students, primarily for the engineering class, because it presents a very rational signal, a very rational line for students to learn on. You have preamp, EQ, sends, then like a passive fader. But I also have a lunchbox with some Shadow Hills and API and Alicia stuff in there. And I always have students start by just going through a typical sort of Scarlett Focusrite. Yeah. Learning how to get a viable signal from that. Mm-hmm. Create a track using that, and then I have them swap in an analog line for vocals, and they start to hear something about the circuit topology, something about the harmonic distortion, something about the sound, just to be I don't like actually being overly technical about this stuff. Something about the sound of the analog line. is more believable. That's the best way I
Right.
can put it, where you're not questioning the track or its qualities. You're just like, that's the track. It sounds good. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like the thing
And
is, like I'm starting to build up like some outboard gear because I want to get into that type of stuff. And for example, I'm running through a Focusrite Sapphire 56, right?
yeah, sure.
And
So
so
it's a good bit of gear.
yeah, and the thing is, I had a PreSonus Audio Box 44 VSL, right? It was pretty beginner
Very
stuff,
good.
and I'm looking at the difference, and like I'm taking tracks that I recorded, 2 years ago compared to now, and I hear a little bit of a difference, but for some reason, I'm actually not like, okay, I'm finding that, for example, preamps, they're so focused on the minute details that I'm actually not hearing as much of a difference as maybe you are, because I don't know.
You know what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what Phil Ramone had to say about this.
Okay.
I saw him speak in Leeds at an Art of Record production conference I was presenting at.
Okay.
And one of the things he said was, I could sit down 5, 6 different engineers behind the same gear with the same musicians, and they would produce totally different sounding records.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we tend to early on, so I talk about this a lot with my students. We tend to very early on overly make recording overly technical and fetishize gear because it's emotionally reassuring.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
we have this checklist of things where, like, I used the Shadow Hills Monogamma. I high passed my reverb, or I low passed it, depending on what you want. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I side chained my bass under my kick. I did this. I did that. I used this. I did that. Therefore, this is a good recording.
That's not
You
how
know
it
what I mean?
works. Yeah.
And I think that is 99% of the game, because it takes years to develop your ears to the point, and it's not something you can really learn consciously. It's not
Right.
like you can really ear train in any way beyond simply immersing yourself in
Right.
in the practice and in the process. But there's a lot, but early on, when you don't have, like, I know for a fact that a lot of my mastering work, my colleague over in England, he makes fun of me, the gear I use, the stuff I do. I'll release something sometimes, and he'll write me and be like, that's just like way too much sub. And I'll be
Right.
like, Russ, it's techno. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
exactly.
But now I've had enough feedback. I've had a lot of that work, some of that work, I've mastered records nominated for Junos. I've had stuff top Beatport. I've put out like thousands of tracks. So I've had enough feedback to know that I'm fine. But if I didn't have that feedback, I would constantly be worrying about whether or not my work is good enough.
Yeah.
And the only way, because it never occurs, because you have no way of really benchmarking your ears, the only way to take that idiot energy and do something productive with it is to muck about with gear and stuff like that. I honestly, and so with my students, I always say, like, forget that. Take the energy you'd spend on that and get on projects. Work
Right.
on projects. If you want to produce, that's fine. Like, have your passion projects, but just be involved in projects however you can. If you can be a mic monkey one day, fantastic. Go in and move mics for whoever's behind the board. If you can mix something, great. When I train mastering engineers, I don't do it so much anymore, but when I did, I would have them just simply sit in the back of the room for about 18 months while I worked day in and day out. And they wouldn't realize really what was happening, but they would be receiving ear training in so far as, and the type of ear training I like to teach, which is, it's not conceptual. They're just hearing pre-masters and mixes being taken to master, over and again. And so they start to hear eventually over time what needs to happen. And mixing is difficult that way too, because there's no correct answer, right? This is not an objective art. It is a purely creative art, and the technical stuff is used to sell gear to people.
Yeah.
To make you feel like your line is deficient. The Scarlett is fantastic, but because it's cheap, relatively cheap,
Yeah.
people will, or because it can't pass, with the same precision as like, links or something like that, people will say it's deficient.
Right.
Well, of course not. I've put out stuff using the Scarlett, like film score stuff, that's done just fine. It's just, it's not an objective art, and the recording is not objective either. Right. And that's like I think the hardest truth that everyone has to face. So like you can't learn your way into a hit record. You have to just get out there, and you'll hear what producers do and what people do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
that's always my caution about discussions about gear early on. You need to have enough. You need to have, I would say, have one good channel strip. Two, if you want stereo, that's great. Two pre's, two EQs. But otherwise, just like go work on people's projects and be exposed to various gear that way, because they're just tools. And the most important thing is to develop confidence in your hearing.
Right. And the thing is, I've never gone to school for any of this stuff, right? And so like, right now I'm doing like a Bachelor of Music for viola at university, right?
That was the path I took.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I did not receive an audio engineering education. I learned about audio engineering by being a songwriter in a band, doing session work.
That's literally me right now, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's much better. I'm completely I learned the way people learned back in the day, which is on the job.
Yeah.
I was in the studio, and like, for instance, the first mixing session I really paid attention to was the first album I put out that was being mixed,
Yeah.
I would do work with other people. I like, for instance, I'll tell you this story. So a good friend of mine in the late 90s was a guy named Johnny Natural Nahara. And he has a Grammy for production work with Usher. He's got a co-write on the really famous Usher song, the do 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 do.
Oh yeah. That one, yeah, I got you.
That's it. He MDs for Jay-Z, Kanye, Britney Spears, all these people. He's just huge, right?
Yeah.
And I remember I think it was 97 or 98, he was laying down a cover of House of the Rising Sun. And for some project, right? Because back then you couldn't go on the internet and get it. Like, you had to create these things.
Yeah.
And I was doing guitar. And I just remember I was doing a lot of session work. I was very active. But what I remember about that session, and it stuck with me forever, is that we went until it was perfect. Nothing was going to be fixed in post. We spent hours and hours nailing this guitar part. And I didn't know what he was listening for. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, it was a balance between the performance and the line that was being performed to, and there were adjustments being made and whatnot. And that was just to get the guitar part. And this wasn't really all that important of a project,
Yeah.
But that session stuck with me as like a perfect example of why I think it's so important to get out and work, as opposed to thinking you're going to learn how to be a great producer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Like, two things. So one, I got a friend there's a school called Algonquin College here, and they have an audio engineering school, and a friend of mine studies there. And since he knows like all the quote unquote book facts, I let him come over to the studio to have a look at my mixes and see how it goes. And so he came over and he was like, "Hey man, like, your vocal is like 1.6 ratio on the compressor, like it should be 1.2. I'm like, "But it sounds better 1.6. It just sounds fuller for some reason." Then he's like, "No, but the book says this." And I'm like, honestly, I'm working with sound. I'm not working with numbers, right?
Yeah, there are no magic settings. Exactly. I mean, there's good rules of thumb. Like, if you're at 5-1 on your bass or something, unless you're doing something artistic and creative, then you might want to look at how you're hitting the compressor. But yeah, there's no, because the thing about that too is, after 16 years of teaching this stuff,
the
way to explain this stuff is crystal clear to you after a while. And for me, I always just say this: you can't learn the settings because you don't know what the input is, what the program is,
Right.
the material is that you're working on. You don't know how it was recorded. That's also why, blaming mastering for the loudness war. I mean, there's stuff I get from studios. There's a studio in Toronto. It's very, very well known. It's produced a lot of great material, and they don't use EQs. They do a lot of their tone shaping via compression. And when it comes in, it's hard on the ears because it sounds just hyper compressed. But that's the sound, and it's fine. There is no right or wrong.
Right.
I've always liked what Claude Debussy had to say about this. Pleasure is the law.
Yeah.
Or I always like to freak out my students by giving them the very first line of the Satanic Bible. Do what thou willst is the whole of the law. It is just like, it always freaks them out. But it's not like I'm a practicing Satanist. That really sums it up for me here.
Of course.
Which is to say that you have to be a big boy or a big girl and deal with the hard emotional truth of your creativity, which is that there's no reason why anyone does anything except for that they think it sounds good. And that's all it should be. So to evaluate students, they have to follow common practice procedure early on. That's what they're evaluated on, right? Like, do they know the practice procedure? And they can give me, like, when they're going to diverge from common practice, like, let's say they're not going to set their mix anchor points. And for some reason, something bizarre, like the kick drum is way off to the left side. They just, in the README file that accompanies the submission, they just have to say, my kick drum is not centered. Right. If they tell me why, I take a point off. It doesn't matter why, it doesn't matter what the gear is. It doesn't matter there is none of that. You use your ears. When you listen to some of the best records ever made, they're complete train wrecks. They're terrible from a mix. The mixes are I mean, the example I love is Can't Get No Satisfaction. If you know what you're listening for, Keith Richards mistakenly clicks on distortion and clicks it off because he had this new thing, this new stomp box back then. There's a total error in the track.
Oh, wow.
But it took me actually listening for it to hear it. You know what I mean?
I never knew that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, next time I hear that song, I'm going to listen for that.
Well, listen for the guitar. He mistakenly clicks it on. So he thinks it's going to go to the chorus, but it doesn't go to the chorus, and he clicks it on and clicks it off. It's hilarious. And I can't unhear it now.
It's also crazy how, just like physically doing the mixing, and like, for example, I got a little mini vocal booth here, and so I have a sound room where I do the mixing, and then they're in the vocal booth, and so sometimes during the room I'm like, holy crap, I hear things so differently now that he's not right next to me. And so I'm thinking, I'm like, holy crap, just like doing all this, I'm noticing different things. I'm noticing what I do with the EQ. I'm noticing what I do with the ratio and like all that stuff. And it's mind-blowing to me, and how like a little movement in the impedance or the compression or the release or something completely changes the sound of a song before you record it.
I think it's because these technologies model hearing. So their rationale and justification is primarily psychoacoustic. And so we get this sense that we can somehow learn how to be good, how to solve for X. But it'd be like talking to a painter about how they get this particular hue of blue. They would look at you like you're from Mars if you started talking about whatever the psychoacoustic equivalent is for eyesight. They would be like, I mixed it together and it looked good. And over time, I realized that it dried differently, so I did it this way. I apply it a little bit lighter or darker than it should, and it's the same thing, right? It's the exact same thing. The kiss of death is when you become completely, or I can put this differently. The way I teach is I love to ask the two questions. When we're doing audio engineering, I always ask, I'm going to give this away now, but I always ask first class, what's the best mic to record a snare drum? And they'll give me all these models. And of course, the answer, I'm just playing a game, but the answer is whatever mic you have available, whatever the best mic is available. Or in songwriting, we'll often, the first class, I'll just ask people, we'll just say like, what are great songs? And we'll spend about 40 minutes. Each student says what they give a song, and we listen to it. and then we'll say, we'll just put it to a vote. And at the end of the class, there's never a single song that everyone agrees is a great song. And the point is, it's a great song because you think it's great. It's a great record or a great production because you think it's great. Stop trying to create great productions or great songs and get on with the work of just producing and writing songs,
Right. And like whenever I look at, now that you mentioned it, the idea is coming into my head. Like, for example, if you listen to an orchestra recording, they always put the name of the conductor. Why? Because the conductor's ideas on textures and timbres is what is being portrayed in the performance. Sure. Just like when you're listening to an actual song, like a mix or something, you're listening for the opinions and the ideas of the audio engineer, not the art. I guess kind of the artists themselves, but it's kind of like a balance, right? And
so here's what I'd say about that. So something to keep in mind. This is the subject of my third book, actually. It's called Representing Sound. And I'll be updating my second book, Understanding Records, for Bloomsbury, actually, this summer to incorporate a lot of this material because I only figured out how to really articulate it in the last few years. And it's this. When you listen to a record, if we were to put on When the Levee Breaks right now, we would say to ourselves, and you ask someone, like, what are you hearing? They'll often tell you, kick drum, snare, hi-hat, guitar, bass, vocals. In other words, sounds. Yeah. But you're not. You're hearing a single sound produced by speaker or headphone technology, which is designed to trick your psychophysiology into believing it detects the presence of multiple sounds. So we're using sound to portray sounds. And so when the way that we typically talk and think about record production now, though, we mistake the subject of the communication, the thing that's being portrayed, for communication itself. So in other words, we don't acknowledge that the subject of the communication is what the recording of the orchestral thing is a portrait of the textures that the conductor creates or what have you. Right. And instead, we mistake it for an orchestral performance. And so the proof's in the pudding there. So you can put on headphones and run a city block, and you're never any closer or further to the snare drum than where it's mixed to sound. And you can set up speakers and walk right in between and through them, and you're never any closer to that snare drum. Right. What we hear is a representation of sound. And 99% of pedagogy and conceptualization, even by practitioners of the production process, doesn't understand that. And so that's another thing I think to keep in mind when we're talking about this stuff.
Right. So like as far as, I wouldn't say, I don't like using the word importance, but like as far as importance from the engineer to the artist himself, how do you think they connect? Who's more important? Stuff like that.
Well, so this is moderately controversial.
Yeah, I
know. I think that by not understanding what we're hearing, by not understanding that when we listen to a record, we hear a sound that represents other sounds. And that sound is animated. If you understand sample rates, it's basic stop motion animation, which occurs at a rate at least of 44,100 snapshots per second. Right.
Yeah.
But when we don't understand that, we don't fully grasp that we're looking at, say, fashion photography, but we're only considering it in terms of the model's pose when the actual artwork is happening somewhere else. The model's pose matters. Jimmy Page's guitar solo on When the Levee Breaks matters. But we have to understand that that's not the communication. That's the thing portrayed. Right. And part of the communicative agency of the thing is the thing portrayed. Like, it gets complicated. But when you're asking in terms of importance, I would go so far as to say that the producer is the author of the recording the same way a conductor is the author of the orchestral performance. Authorship is shared and distributed, and that's really interesting. But at the end of the day, we designate a single authorial agent in the process, and that would be the record producer. And for me, it's that simple. The same way the author of a fashion, photograph is the photographer and not the model posing.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, there's the drawing itself, and then there's the idea in the head of the artist that creates the drawing, and then there's the paintbrush as well. It's kind of, they all mingle together. Now, my question is...
yeah, but also just, the actual communication itself, the thing that we're talking about, if we were to look at a photograph, we would say this is a photograph. The person who created this is the photographer.
Yeah.
The subject was the pose. It's no different with a record, right? This is a representation of Jimmy Page's guitar playing. It is not Jimmy Page's guitar playing. Therefore, the person who created that is the person who produced that recording. And maybe their crew as well,
Yeah. But now, as far as my next question was, as creating that perception of the artist is playing, how do you go about picking a specific preamp?
Yeah. Well, first off, I pick a preamp according to the preamps I have available to me.
That is good.
That seems really obvious. But so I'll tell you, the most boring conversation I ever have is with people who are just starting to record, and they always want to talk about models and makes.
Yeah.
And for some reason it always starts with microphones, and then it becomes about pre's, and then you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if ever you're having that conversation with someone who sort of does this for a living, they're being patient with you, because it's a bit like sitting down for a coffee outside of the context of this sort of a conversation where it's like expected. But you know what I mean? Like, it's like sitting down with a coffee with a lawyer, and rather than talking about baseball, you're going to talk about not just the law, but like minutia of the law.
Right. Yeah.
So I go about choosing a preamp. So I'll say this. I purposely restrict my choices. I do not invest in a lot of gear. I invest in gear I like, and then I restrict myself. So with mastering, for instance, I have a line that I run, and that's my line. And it's almost like cybernetic in the sense that, like, these things they hear, their ears. In fact, they're technical models of ears, right? The whole thing goes back to something called an ear phonautograph, which was basically a cadaver's, cut off ear with a chaff of wheat affixed to it. And Alexander Graham Bell and Chichester Bell, them shouting at this thing, right? Basically, it is a tympanic model, like the human tympanum. That's the model of hearing, and along with the transduction there. And so I think that when I'm choosing a pre, I'm thinking I restrict myself so that I know, let's look at the Shadow Hills Mono Gamma. It's got these 3 different settings. You can have a nickel wound transformer, a steel wound transformer, or an op amp. And you get to know what these things do to a particular sound. And so, maybe you're hearing, a steel string guitar, and you're like, wow, that would sound really good with the nickel wound transformer. But, the mic might be at an angle. The performer might perform a particular way. Something might be going on with the barometric pressure. Who knows?
Right.
And so you try other settings, but I restrict myself to very few pre's. And I dial in to the pre that is most convenient given the line. So if I'm in an install set, if I'm at the Toft board, I'm going to use the pre on the board. Yeah. Unless the signal needs even more beefing up, and if it does, then there's an issue there.
Yeah, like there are so many people that I'm meeting now. Like, of course, I have not even close to any experience as much as you, but like I'm meeting them, and they're like, "Hey, if you don't have this preamp with this sound and this mic, then you're horrible. You're a bad engineer." But like that's not how it works. Like I was watching a documentary of Dream Theater. And it was Dream Theater went to the studio, and they were like, "You don't have this Destresser? Okay, we're not doing our album with you because that Destresser is key." Like, how do you go about, like, you can basically make a sound with any limitation of gear, right?
Yes. So I got a PhD in order to ensure that I never had to deal with that crap. I was in the studio. Most of my bandmates have Grammys and Billboard #1s. We were doing very, very well, and I just decided I don't want this life. And I also thought, you know what, I do like aspects of the it's like being a novelist and you teach creative writing.
Yeah.
I like that. There's an element, there's something a little more, for me, a little more substantive than just working for your own aggrandizement. And I'm not an ascetic, don't get me wrong, but I felt very uncomfortable with how inherently narcissistic the industry was, and how you adopted these narcissistic tendencies, and completely lost track of the work and the process and the creativity which drove you to risk everything for a life in music to begin with, And so I would have these conversations, and I'd notice that you'd be beholden to people who just, out of ego cling to this notion that they have, that for instance, a Destresser is necessary to create a record. Maybe they know how to dial in their tone, but my goodness, imagine if you were just completely open to the process, all the different sounds you could create and come up with.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, I hear stuff like that as tremendously insecure.
Yeah.
If the person had confidence that they were, an artist and capable of creativity, that's all you really need. And then you put yourself in a context. It's not like he'd be engineering anyways. The person who insisted on the Destresser, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They must like the punish setting. That's a good setting, but I don't. I find that really problematic, to the point where I was like, forget it. I'm gonna do something different. I'm not going to expose myself to this. Plus, the thing I liked about academics as well is that I get to be 1,000 times more creative than my most successful friends, because all day, every day, all I'm doing is working on music.
Yeah.
It's just that 90% of it isn't going to really do anything besides move the artist I'm working with and their little circle of family, friends, and the listenership they have, but I don't have to care what 14-year-olds are dancing to in high school. And sometimes I get to work on that stuff too, because I like it. It's just, it doesn't matter, And I can work on techno, then do a string quartet, then do like a sparse folk album, and then do like a growling metal record, all in the same day,
Oh yeah, like it sounds like a very like healthy relationship to music. Like right now I'm recording, actually a friend of mine, he's recording his album with me at my studio, and so this is just good practice. I don't charge much at all. I just want to practice mixing, right?
Sure.
So he came over and I was like, hey man, I only have like these 7 different mics, SM7B, Audio Technica, whatever, and I have only this rack gear, like do you think it'll be okay? And then he was like, man, I'm open to try anything. So we tried we did like maybe 5 different takes of the same song, because it's just piano and vocal, and I used different compressors, different EQs, different stuff, and he was like, hey, you know what, I actually like this sound. It's way more open compared to this sound, compared to that sound.
Excellent.
And it sounded like it was a healthy relationship. I got to know like what type of timbres he liked compared to me, like how he goes about sound and stuff like that.
And that's exactly what the production relationship should be.
Exactly.
It should be one of artistic collaboration, sharing a vision. You have to learn how to share the vision. I mean, that sounds like really good to me. And then sometimes, like I remember recording in, I think it was 97, and back then I had a producer. I liked to have a producer. I wanted to write songs and perform and have one person who was equally invested, who I could trust to translate that music onto record.
Right.
And this was a person, we listened to the same records. We would hang out all the time and listen to records and talk about records we liked. This person shared my vision, helped shape that vision so it was suitable for recording. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that is, but then at the same time, at some point I remember he was like, I think it was like a U47. He was like, we need a U47 for your voice. It was like, we tried a bunch of stuff. We'd spent days. And so we piled in the car, drove like 18 hours from Boston to like Chicago, just to grab a U47 that we had access to.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's okay. Like to the caveat is that these are tools. And sometimes, I trust that because that sort of comes organically. But also that came because I trusted the producer, you know?
Right. Yeah. So with his experience, you guys create an experience. Yeah. But like, also I had one more question before we end.
Sure.
As far as people, because I know a lot of artists who they're musicians, and you talked about how performing really wasn't your thing, and so you went to studio engineering. Do you think that people drop performing because of the influences of the industry itself, or do you think it's because somehow they just fall in love with studio engineering, or like is it a balance of both?
I think that people don't want to hear musicians perform. I think that may not make sense when you're young because you go to concerts, and you want to hear people perform. But as you get older, you realize that, you know, sometimes you're on vacation and the context is there and you're like, oh, I'm going to hear a salsa band. But it's all just like a Vegas show. And most people are just annoyed by a live performance now. Music is occupies, this is just my personal opinion, but I've seen over the course of my life, music going from being something that was something that was part of our culture. It was something you listened to music. People had nice stereo systems. People went to live shows to dance on a Friday night, like a local band would come play. And now I don't see that. And I don't see it. I mean, I will ask my students, every last one of them, and these are people who want to become musicians. I'll say, how many of you listen to music? And all of them put up their hand. They're like, of course, I'm always listening to music.
Right.
And I say, well, okay, you know, let me tell you, you're at the age where I was at when I was in a band and you know, I was at Berkeley for music and all that kind of stuff. So here's what Thursday night looked like. We would go out, play music, come back home, party, you know, have beers, whatever. But then at some point, inevitably, always, the lights went out. Everyone sat, you know, it sounds weird by today's standards, sat around, and you would listen to records until like 3 or 4 in the morning. That awesome. Was, you know, that was what you did. And then like you'd go see a live show if your buddy was performing. I remember, or if something special was happening. Like I remember two things really stick out. Elliott Smith came through one time. And that was before he'd been to the Grammys or anything. Yeah. And he had a record with Kill Rock Stars that made the rounds. And we were like, we got to see this guy play live. And he was fantastic live. Same with Gomez on their first record before they became like a jam band, you know, Tijuana Lady. Right. That sort of, they came through and we saw them in like really small venues, but we weren't interested in going and seeing the Stones play Fenway, you know? Yeah. Like who cares? That's not really like a music thing. But then I'll ask my students, how many of you do that? How many of you listen to music when you're not doing something else? And none of them do. Wow. You know, even if they own vinyl, none of them do. And I think that's just indicative of the fact that music is becoming very much a value added for other cultural activities.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, as far as this is like weird topic, but like evolution, I feel like we always want the most efficient thing, right? And so as far as music, like you have to get in your car, you have to drive to the venue, you have to buy the ticket, you have to sit down, you got to wait, and then you got to watch. But like now it's just
maybe
like
it sounds terrible.
Yeah, but like now you just go on YouTube and it's there. Right.
That's right.
And so like for me being an actual classical musician, I find, because I do all the performances, I go on stage and I play. Right. And so going to concerts, I go to like maybe 1 or 2 concerts every week just because watching live is so different than watching in recordings. Right. Or hearing in recordings. And like I feel like people undervalue performances now because they're so used to having that vinyl or that stereo sound that you're talking about.
Yeah. See, but it's interesting. So here's something I will say. I will happily go see a symphony. I will happily go see, you know, a recital from the classical tradition. I'll happily go see that because that music is made for performance.
Right.
And people devote themselves to learning how to perform.
Yeah.
Other genres, that you know, it's not the case. Yeah. I've been in bands where what really mattered was how you looked and, you know, did you act cool and did you know,
oh my God,
could you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And actually, I hate this argument because I teach pop music, and often people will say that, and I'll say that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
But what I mean is that in terms of media, classical music was generated for a totally different medium.
Right.
which was, concert hall live performance or, chamber salon sort of performances.
Yeah.
It wasn't made for record, that's for sure, because we didn't have the technology, whereas popular music has slowly, and by that I mean basically everything, has slowly evolved to a very antisocial pursuit, which I love and think is incredibly valuable. Right. But at some point, it becomes gadget consumption. It becomes something I think about streaming and Spotify and how when you're not buying records, you're not invested. And I stream now, right? I'm not invested in the music. I no longer, when, let's say, Pink Floyd's Breathe comes up. This is one of the most important songs for me, like changed my life, gave it a direction, was, just simply the sound and the feeling I got listening to that record was enough when I was staring down, graduating from high school and saying, what am I going to do? It was enough for me to say, I'm going to move in that direction.
Yeah.
And now when it comes up on Spotify and I flick to something else, I haven't really decided I don't feel like hearing Pink Floyd. I'm just on Spotify and I'm just skipping to something else, and slowly it becomes less and less important who I'm listening to. And one of the things I love to do is I love to go, because you remember, like, pop music is my work, right? Now I'm always listening to music. And one of my favorite things to do is to go put on like some playlist, like music for concentration or whatever, and just go for a nice long walk in the bush down by the river,
Yeah.
I have no idea who or what I'm listening to. It's just, I'm on Spotify. And I think that that is going to have a far more profound influence on record production than any single record or track that comes out from now on.
With that being said, it's funny you say that, because this happened to me this morning. I was in the gym, for example, and I just downloaded this random playlist on Spotify, and I was skipping until I, like, the exact sound I was looking for, like a heavy kick, double kick, death metal, growling, just came up. Right. And as soon as it came up, I was like, cool, let's go. Right. Yes. But like, I didn't care who it was. I just looked for that sound. So
absolutely mood based. So what I think's happening is that broadcasting has completely receded as a paradigm of musical communications. Listeners no longer tune in, and top down communications are outmoded and boring. And just look at the way you're encouraged to navigate the entirety of recorded musical history vis-a-vis these streaming devices. So often it's mood-based playlisting, right? And so what you're really doing is you are curating your life. You are programming and sequencing music to suit the requirements of your life. You want music. I like music for a lazy stroll by the river. You wanted cardio pump music. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, so there was a little while where I thought, well, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe streaming's are going to become like the new major label, and we'll have, research and development deals. And that's how we got, Dark Side of the Moon. But I think that the album, everyone pegs, the album's dead. Most people peg that as just many years ago.
Yeah.
But I think that, I say the record industry is dead now, and that we're living in the streaming industry. And the reason why I say that is I believe streaming is not a new format. It's a new medium, and that music is porting, and that this medium has obsolesced the older record medium. Which survived from the gramophone to untethered downloads on iTunes.
Right.
And next year, iTunes, or the year after, iTunes is shuttering and closing. So we're not even going to have untethered downloads anymore. So I really, truly believe, and you can see too, playlisting being the dominant interaction for listeners with streaming. They've done studies, right? They can draw the data. And I think of the 159 million free and paid users on Spotify, a remarkable number, something like less than 13%, but that may be overstating it. I think it may even be like less than 7% of those users listen to albums, and the rest listen to playlists.
Right. Yeah. I don't find myself listening to, unless like someone recommended an album, I would listen to like maybe parts of it, but then I would stop.
Right.
And,
And the fandom's totally different. Like I remember last week I was watching my oldest. He plays for the Junior Mustangs, and I was watching a practice, and that's where I sort of listened to new stuff. But I was online and I saw an article, and they said, Yeezy's flipped his lid, and I was like, "Yay, it's Yeezy season!" And so I was like, "What's he done now?" And then I was like, "Oh my gosh, there's new tracks out!"
Yeah.
And so you just go to Spotify, you check them out, and then on to something else. Whereas before, you would have heard it on the radio, you would have then maybe gone and purchased the album, but more importantly, he would have packaged an album,
right?
He would have, and then there would have been the whole rollout routine, and there would have been a tour, and October is Kanye at the JLC,
right?
Or
right.
you got to go to the ACC or whatever. But this stuff's not happening anymore, and it's not viable anymore financially either. They asked Roger Daltrey of The Who. They asked him. They said, "Are you guys working on an album?" And he just laughed and said, "Why would we?"
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, like if you just create a source of music for people just to take in, they don't have to go out and buy the album or anything. It's just the easier it is, the more they'll do it.
Yeah. And these are creative people too, right? Like they like creativity. So if no one's really interested in music, they're happy to take pictures, paint, draw, go for walks. Like it's music is no longer a viable profession. So people are less professional about it.
Right.
So I don't think it's a question of reskilling, but you have to really think about, you almost have to reorient your skills. So, like I do a lot of fun scoring work.
Yeah.
For Buddy primarily because I get to do whatever I want. And I know that it'll be used on something, and that's enough,
Right, and like last question, I could talk about this for hours, by the way.
Sure,
but like,
me too.
it's great. But if I'm ever in London, I'll let you know.
You should for sure, man. I'll buy you a beer. We'll
sounds
like,
good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
But like, last thing, do you think that creativity is dead? Or is it like because we're talking about how artistry, like we're making songs and stuff, but the sound that you're getting from the studio is what people are actually being connected to, right? So do you think that less artistry, more just the sound, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's the opposite.
Okay, why?
So there's a great story that I like where I believe it was John Dido Lurie, who's like a Roshi at a Zen center somewhere.
Yeah.
And he's very into photography, and he told this story which I loved. And it apparently was really either he did it or it was a story that struck him while he was quote unquote becoming a photographer, not professionally, but if you know what I mean, where photography was going to be something that would be part of his life. And he told the story of a teacher who taught sculpting pottery.
Okay.
And he divided the class into two. And this one class, he said, you have to create one perfect clay pot this semester. And that'll get you an A+, but it has to be perfect. And the other class, he said, we have 99 days until the end of the semester. You have to create 99 clay pots.
Okay.
And of course, the one clay pot, they couldn't even produce the clay pot. They couldn't get down to it. They were too busy trying to meet this idea about what they were supposed to be doing.
Like a perfect clay pot, yeah.
Yeah, and then the group with 99, they produced about 5 or 6 clay pots. And so creativity should work that way. You should have a process, and you should engage in it all the time. And every so often you go back and you go, man, that really worked. Right. And that's what's available to us now. Whereas when you were in the industry, you had to produce a record, 10 to 12 tracks, and 3 of them had to be viable as hits, and they had to hit these metrics and these benchmarks. We're at a point now where, what's the Kanye versus the People track that came out last week?
Oh,
he can just drop something like that. There's no chorus. He's just narcissistically going on with T.I. about his political dabblings. It's just him rapping over a beat saying like, people don't get what I'm doing. and T.I. saying like, yeah, you're right, they don't.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like I was talking to a composer, maybe actually the podcast, I don't know if it'll be before this or after, but he's a composer, and I was talking to him about, because he has never gone to school for classical music, right? He just, knows theory from family, generations.
That's my favorite, even though I'm a professor. Yeah.
Exactly. And I told him, like, how do you compose? He's like, honestly, man, like, he's like, Nofel, do you improvise? And I'm like, actually, I do. So, like, he's like, what do you do when you improvise? I was like, I just do, like I just do it. Like I use the technique that I have to me, and I create something, engaging myself to the emotion that I'm trying to portray, right? And he's like, that's exactly what composing is. And then he's like, I hate school. I'm like, why? He's like, because basically they give you these rules, and if you don't attain to these rules, then you're considered stupid. And that exactly draws us back to when we were talking about technology. Exactly.
And,
that's why I brought it up.
Yeah. Pleasure is the whole of the law. That's it. I mean, it sounds good, and all of here's another way to put that. Every last compositional technique, every last production engineering technique, songwriting technique became a technique because someone hit on it, creatively experimenting. And they liked it, and it worked, and they repeated it, and then the next generation learned it as a technique. Every technique begins as an accident that gets repeated. That's it. There is no. If you think about it, it's not as though the Big Bang happened, evolution occurred, and at some point, while we were developing legs, technique developed along with us. It's just some concept we have. People just do stuff, and it's a way of, I think, creating easily teachable and evaluatable things that we can have in the classroom. Yeah, I like your buddy there.
Yeah, he's a good buddy. He's actually the guy recording the album. But
is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so like when I was in a band in high school, we were recording our album. We needed to make one more song for or something. And he was like, Nofel, okay, so you're gonna come over tomorrow at like 7, and then we're gonna write this song. It's gonna be good. I'm like, dude, the fact that you're saying we're gonna write it at 7 means it's gonna be horrible. Like it should come naturally, right? And then I always tell people like the things happen when you least expect it, right? So
although that said, I don't agree with that. I think I tell my students when we're doing songwriting, I like Ernest Hemingway's approach,
which is
wake up at 8, write until 10:30 a.m. And then even if you're in the middle of a word, when 10:30 a.m. happens, the alarm goes off, walk away and do something else. Because you're not going to be a great songwriter by writing all day. What's going to make you a great songwriter is life experience. Being at, say, a coffee shop and watching someone white knuckle while it seems like they're having a loving conversation. Yeah. And that detail is what you're going to be able to throw into a song. Songs are incredibly simple and easy to write, right?
Yeah.
If compositions are incredible. Art is easy. If it wasn't easy, you would need a PhD to do it. Yeah. It's incredibly easy, and as such, you should be able to just simply sit down and write. The more you can just simply designate a time and get going, the better, because it means you're not thinking so much about it. You're not conceptualizing. It
just happens. Yeah.
It just happens. I think so. Again, like I said, you know what they used to call that when you would overthink things? They used to call it fret work. And this was like creating lists. I need to do this. It was just a way of occupying our natural tendency to fret and worry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. So I firmly believe that the creative process should be a part of your life, and it should be that said, then when inspiration hits, you have the tools to ride the wave, Right. But yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. All right, I think that answers most of the things I wanted to cover today.
Cool. Well, it was fun. It was fun chatting, man.
Yeah, man, you too. So I just want to thank Jay Hodgson for being here today. We talked a lot about sound production and what all the things that go into like actually making that happen and be a thing. Music is something that we all love and enjoy and experience and have our own individual perspective on. And so it was really interesting talking to someone who does it for a living. And so thanks again, Jay Hodgson, for being here. And that was Life with a Sixth Sense. Nofel Jari. Talk to you guys next time. Thanks for